Oh, hang on. Let me just, right. Ilias works for Affinity Water, of which I am fondly aware as I used to live in Hillingdon. And I know at the moment that Affinity Water is sending people around to various houses, encouraging us all to save water and giving us tips on how to do so.
My house today.
Oh, did you? Yes, I already had the gentleman around, and I told him I didn't think I could save any more water than I already was. He was quite impressed when I said I only paid £11 a month for my water. Anyway, Ilias is going to give us a talk. So when he does his presentation, if Alan will mute everybody, Ilias, you will have to unmute yourself. And if people could turn off their videos, because that will give extra bandwidth for the presentation. So over to you, Ilias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen.
Oh, hang on.
I think, Alan, you need to allow me to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliant. If I go on full screen mode, hopefully you can see the first slide.
Yes.
Yes, we can see that.
Brilliant, thank you. So, yeah, my name is Ilias. I work for Affinity Water. I'm a hydrogeologist by training. Started geology as my first degree and then moved into the hydrogeology. And today I'm gonna give you a tour of chalk and groundwater flow as we know it now. Especially over the last 5 years, there has been a lot of investigation into the chalk groundwater flow mechanisms. So I want to start about talking about Affinity Water and the supply-demand challenge we face. The chalk aquifer in general and the chalk streams and how we think about chalk streams or how we used to think about chalk streams. Then moving on to talk about chalk groundwater levels, piezometry, and the importance of marls and other hard grounds in the chalk. Touching a little bit on the role and the spatial distribution of the Artesian boreholes. Why are they important? Then we're going to look at a couple of examples whereby we have good information on changes in groundwater levels from abstraction cessation. Touching on carstification of the chalk a little bit and the role of the superficial deposits, and hopefully bringing all of that to a discussion which we're going to have at the end. So starting from Affinity Water, we are the largest water-only company and supply a population of approximately 3.6 million people at 1.3 million properties. And every day we put into supply 900 million liters of water. We operate a network of over 16,000 kilometers of water mains in 8 communities. So mainly in and around London and the home counties. And then we have 2 distinct geographical areas down in Folkestone and Dover and in the Essex Peninsula. So the biggest challenge that we face as a company is that the area that we operate in has been designated by the government as being under serious water stress. In our central region, we supply approximately 60% groundwater that comes mainly from the chalk, with the remainder 40% being surface water, either direct abstraction from the River Thames itself or imported water from neighboring water companies. Obviously, we have imports and exports from and to neighboring water companies, and you can see the amounts here. The challenge is that by 2080, we estimate that in this area, we will have approximately 1.6 million people in addition to the existing population. So the demand is projected to go high. And at the same time, in order to allow the company to meet the Water Framework Directive objectives and allow the environment to meet the ecological targets, we have to reduce abstraction at sources that have been deemed as unsustainable or damaging to the environment. So on one hand, demand is going up. On the other hand, supply is going down from existing sources. Historically, we have started with what we call sustainability reductions, which is basically reductions in abstraction, mainly since the 90s. And you see here the cumulative water that is lost or reduced in terms of groundwater abstraction. Just to put it in the context here, this is, so by 2020, we had approximately 65 megaliters a day. And to put it in the context, approximately our total groundwater supply is in the order of 500. Now, further reductions are being planned for 2024, and that will take this number closer to 100 or more megaliters a day. So that's about 20% or more of our total groundwater supply, and that is only ever increasing. In the last 5-year period, as you see here, there's been quite a step change in the rate of abstraction reduction. And as I say, all of this is meant to allow more water in the aquifer, because we abstract from the chalk aquifer. And the water that we leave in the chalk aquifer and not abstract anymore is then available for river-based flow. So in order for that to work and for the abstraction cessation to allow this water to feed the river's base flow, we have to think of an idealized system like this one, which is how we normally or used to think about the chalk aquifer, where you have a bucket. Let's say this is our bucket, the chalk aquifer. You have a water table in it, and where this water table intercepts the topography, right here, we have a spring, and then our chalk river is gaining base flow continually as we go downstream. This is during the winter months where we have high recharge, and therefore the water table is up here. Here is the spring. Now, if we move into the summer months, where we have a seasonal recession of the groundwater levels, the water table is now at a different location, lower down. This is the place where now it intercepts the topography. We call this a perennial head. And this is where the river is now flowing, and it gains more water as we move downstream. This section between here and here, we call it the winterborne because it seasonally goes up and down, heavily related to where the groundwater table is. Now, all of this, again, is an idealized situation where the chalk is one bucket. But in this particular setting, if we are to put a borehole next to a river, we can have this kind of situation whereby under pumping influence, due to the suction effect, we cause groundwater levels to decline, and we cause what we call a cone of depression, an upside down cone. And in this situation, where this whole aquifer is one bucket and you have a river on top, you can have this extreme whereby the river is flowing in the upstream section, being dry in the middle bit, and then flowing again downstream as it passes through this area where pumping is taking place. Now, all of that is all nice, but it is a theoretical situation, and in nature, very rarely you see these things. This assumes that the aquifer acts as a bucket, and it is what we call homogeneous and isotropic. Now, when we started looking into the impact of abstraction on river flows, and this is pretty much what I do every day, we have lots of those boreholes at Affinity Water abstracting different volumes. And the million-dollar question is, how much of the water that you now abstract is at the expense of river flow? And under what conditions? Is it the same during all times? Is it different under different times, different in droughts, different in floods? Does it vary? Is it a fixed amount? And is it one-to-one? For example, if you take 5 million liters of water a day, does it mean But if you switch off that abstraction, you will have 5 megaliters in the river. Or is it a percentage of that? So one of the examples I came across when we started this particular study here 5 years ago approximately, I came across this data set. And this is where it all started for me, because I started thinking differently then about the chalk after I saw this. So just to set the scene here, what we see is 3 different water levels all in the chalk from this borehole here, which is used for observation purposes. So this borehole is not pumped, but it is quite close to a pumping borehole, like 20 meters away. We have 3 pipes down the same borehole. So one finishing at 10 meters, the middle one finishing at 17 meters, and the deep one finishing at 33 meters. They're all isolated by bentonite, and the gravel pack here allows this screened section in this area, this at 17 and this at 33. So the idea here was to see whether we would have different water level responses under pumping or non-pumping influence. So when we cause the suction effect in the system. So we had spot water levels, so manual dips here. In this top piezometer, the water level is usually below the 10 meters, so it's dry. So this is all flat lining here. Usually there is no water within this during pumping influence. The 17 meter, the middle one, has water in it, but it shows that there are times when there is a fixed differential in the water levels between the deeper one, the 33 meter one, and the middle one in the order of 5 meters or so, from 45 to about 50. But there are also times when this departs. Now, when I first saw this data, I thought there's definitely something wrong about this, because you can't have this pattern here where all the water levels are dancing around doing roughly the same thing and have these extremes here. So this must be surely something wrong, or some erroneous data. Now, the interesting thing is that there are times when there is water in the shallow borehole here, and the shallow and the middle one have exactly the same water level in this situation. Then they depart. These 2 water levels have a similar differential, but then there are times when this differential increases. And it is not just that erroneous value, it is also that, and to an extent this one. So when we installed continuous water level monitoring here in this borehole on an hourly basis, we found out that what we saw here back in 2012, which was a drought, by the way, was repeated again in 2017. So although this differential between these 2 water levels stays at about 4 to 5 meters, during the drought peak, it increases up to 15 meters. So something is going on between these 2 sections of the chalk, the 17 meter and the 33 meter, that causes the water levels to react differently under abstraction influence. Now, I have to say here, throughout this period, the abstraction nearby has been constant. So we're not playing up and down with the abstraction. It is constant, base load all the time. The only difference is that during droughts, background groundwater levels being low, this differential is higher here and higher here. And when we are in average conditions or above average conditions, it tends to be the same. So obviously that suggests that there are 2 water levels in the chalk. It's not one bucket with 1 water level in it. There is at least a second layer that acts differently under pumping influence than the layer that we abstract from. We abstract from the deeper layer at around about this depth. And this is another graph to basically show the same thing, but in a bit of a more zoomed in. You have abstraction here with a black line going up, starting from 0, going up, plotted on this axis. 10 megaliters approximately, 15, about 18 megaliters. So step, 1 step, 2nd step, 3rd step. the water levels in the two piezometers, the 17 and the 30 meter piezometer, start being, very close. When abstraction starts, there's a nice drawdown effect here. Equilibrium is not reached because we step up again, and there's a second drawdown, and then a third drawdown as the abstraction increases. Now, again, the water level seems to have stabilized somehow, but not reached equilibrium yet. There is this recovery here, which is not related to the abstraction because it's constant. The interesting thing here is that this is also shown here, but it comes earlier here than here. There's a bit of a lag in this line, although this is the shallow aquifer. I'll come back to this because this is related to rainfall recharge. But the interesting thing is that when abstraction switches off again, the deep water level rebounds and jumps above the shallow water level at the 17 meter piezometer. They continue for a couple of days like that until eventually the shallow water level gets the signal and rises above the deep, and then the two match for some time. Then they depart again before abstraction recommences, and the deep rises a bit until we start the abstraction, and we have step 1, step 2, and the two again have this 4 or 5 meter differential in groundwater levels plotted here, as we saw earlier. So clearly, this is a layered system here, where we're abstracting from the deep layer. The deep layer here at 33 meters responds very, very quickly. Every time we step up, there's equivalent drawdown. There is some contribution from the shallow layer because it seems to be responding to a degree, but nowhere near what the deep layer does. And there is a differential in the head that is maintained throughout this pumping sequence. When we stop the pumping, the pressurization builds up in the deep aquifer. It causes the water level to jump above the shallow water level until this relationship is fixed here, where the two reach equilibrium. So there's some water passing down under abstraction influence to contribute to the deep abstraction, which is stopping when the abstraction stops, and we no longer have water passing from the shallow layer to the deep layer. Then the deep layer is pushing water up, but this takes time to materialize, and we reach equilibrium in this section. All of that is nicely put in this diagram. Abstraction borehole from ground level down to a certain depth, approximately 30 meters or so, being cased off. So the water that gets into our abstraction borehole is through this section, which is the open hole section. And then we have these three sets of piezometers, shallow, the middle, and the deep. You looked at water levels at the middle one and the deep one. And we are in this section of the chalk in the new pit. Somewhere above that, we have a section of marls. We don't know exactly where they are, but we think they are somewhere in between the 17 meter piezometer and the 33 meter piezometer. And we think these are the ones that are responsible for this water level separation, whereby you have a water level there, a water level deeper down under abstraction influence. This is because these are low permeability materials. They contain clay, which is typically low permeability material, and causes some hindrance, so to speak, in the vertical scale. Now, obviously, above here you have a river, the river Ver in this particular case, which may gain or lose water depending on where the piezometer in the shallow aquifer is relative to the river level. So we have to consider this system when we're considering abstraction reductions and what the benefits may be to the nearby river under different conditions. Now, we talked about marls a little bit, and we talked about the new pit chalk, the new pit unit. This is a section that Haydon knows very well, and this is up at the top of the Ver at Kensworth Quarry, and this is the base of the quarry, 0, 5, 10 meters, going up in this scale up to 35 meters. This is a very nice section of the chalk exposed. where basically those key stratigraphical markers that you can see here, the Newbit Marl 2, Glint Marl 1, Southern Flints, Southern Marl, Caben Marl, and so on, the chalk rock, which is mapped in from the BGS and is also found in a number of borehole logs. All of this is exposed up at Kensworth Quarry, so it has been detailed by Mortimer, and it is these stratigraphical markers that help us understand where we are in the chalk in our boreholes. I have a couple of examples later on to show you how we pick up those markers in our boreholes. But basically, if those marls are responsible for causing this hindrance in the vertical scale, and they do not allow free passage of water from one unit to the next, then that is very, very important in terms of the groundwater and surface water interactions. So knowing where we are, knowing where the abstraction is, knowing where the water is taken from when you abstract from a certain borehole, and knowing where the river sits in this geological sequence is really, really critical in order to understand what the groundwater surface water interactions will be. Now, in terms of the chalk units in the Chilterns, we have the whole chalk sequence, more or less. And the chalk is dipping towards the London Basin, so in this direction. So towards higher up in the topography, you meet the lower chalk units, and as you progressively go down deep, downstream, where the rivers are flowing, they flow onto the newer units. So typically, chalk streams rising in the Holywell or Newbit section of the chalk, and then largely flowing into the Lewis in the middle catchment, meeting the C4 chalk at the lower catchments before the chalk dives under the London clay in the London area. Now that is quite important because, as you will see later on, it is effectively the interface between the Lewis and the Newbit that will dictate whether the water that is no longer abstracted will end up in the river and under what conditions. So again, here is several stratigraphical markers, and the importance of these at the moment is not very well understood in terms of hydrogeology, but knowing where we are is really, really critical. So in order to help us understand where we are in the boreholes, because obviously we don't have quarries everywhere where we can see a nice cross section of the chalk, we use geophysical equipment. This equipment down here to measure natural gamma, temperature, conductivity, and a number of other things. And we also have CCTV that we put down in our boreholes to physically inspect the condition of the borehole. So this is also done to understand what the asset is doing over time, whether we need to do borehole rehabilitation, or if there's any problem, if there's collapsing, if there's encrustation, if there are issues with the borehole. But also, it helps us during certain conditions to understand where the inflows are in the borehole, where the fissures are, where the cracks are in the rock, and so on. And in certain cases where we have good visibility, we can actually pick up flint bands, even marl bands. So in this next slide, I have a short video of one of our boreholes. The footage starts from 28 meters down. So from 0 till about 15 meters or so, it is plain cased, and then open hole section from there till the total depth. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but starting from 28 meters, as the camera goes down, this will increase. In this case, we're using a small camera, so we're going down near the side of the borehole. This green pipe is the rising main, where the submersible pump is bolted at the end of it, and these blue pipes are the deep tubes where we use to record water levels. So as the camera starts, it goes down. There's a cavity on the side. You will see there's several flints, I'm sure you will pick up. Going down to 30 meters now. Again, this section of the chalk is relatively smooth. These yellow bands that you pick up are marl bands. And here, I would like to pause here, you see a subvertical fracture, which brings water into the borehole. It stops here at this section, and then it falls down. So you can meet other fractures that do not bring water into the borehole. This particular one does. Now, bear in mind, this footage happened it was January 2018. So that was during a period of relatively low background water levels. During this CCTV survey, the pump is on. So there is pumping going on and the water level has drawn down. And therefore we're able to see this fissure that brings water into the borehole. If we had been in above average conditions and the pump was off, this may have been flooded here. So the water table will be above this, so it wouldn't be as clear to see where the inflow is into the borehole. Whereas now you can see that quite nicely. So we're quite fortunate that we did the survey during these particular conditions. This is important because if you have a river higher up, what we now see is that 32 meters, the water comes into the borehole, there's a clear inflow, but this is still above water table. As I said, we are pumping during this time, but there is an inflow at 32 meters. You see another yellow section with more marls. There's another cavity on this section, but it doesn't bring any water into the borehole. This is the water coming out from top. More subverted fractures would go down, more cavities, but again, they do not contribute any water into the borehole. So there's a discrete horizon at that 32 meter below ground that supplies water in the borehole, but the water level is still further down. We haven't met it yet. So 40 meters now. Sections is smooth, not so many cracks, not so many fissures. And again, still above water table. But we are getting close now as the camera goes down. And there you can see the water. And the camera is now getting in water at 46 meters below ground. So we saw that fissure bringing water into the borehole at 32, 46. We saw the water table under pumping conditions. And this is a summary of what we just saw in that particular borehole. Marl band here, but just above the marl band, you have the vertical fracture stopping at the marl band. Groundwater enters into the borehole, but the pumping water level was approximately a couple of meters below, 10 meters or so below where the water came into the borehole. Now, another thing I mentioned earlier was the geophysical logging. So we use the natural gamma to pick up those changes in the chalk. So especially in the next slide, you will see it a lot better. There are a number of spikes in the natural gamma that we can associate with certain marls. This particular borehole, which is up in Luton, it's quite a deep borehole going down 190 meters. We've gone through a whole chalk sequence, more or less. Lewis, Newbit, Hollywell, Zigzag, Muswellbury, and Meta Gold Clay. And then have tried to associate these natural gamma peaks with a low permeability material, typically being the marls. So up in the Lewis, we identified the Cairn marl, the Southern marl, a number of spikes here associated with the glint marls. And then further down in the Hollywells and Zigzag section, the Plinus marl sitting just below the Melbourne Rock, which again is a distinct unit. And and further down the interface between the West Mulberry chalk and the gold clay, which gives you a lot higher peaks in the natural gamma. So by using natural gamma, you have a good indication of where those marls are and where we're in stratigraphy, even when we're further from chalk exposures from quarries. And we can use this information spatially to construct conceptual models such as this one, for example. This is from the upper and the middle Ver. We saw earlier Kensworth Quarry and the stratigraphy up there, which is up here. Now, based on where those sections are found, we can then correlate and follow through effectively those marls. So for example, the southern marl was found here in this particular production borehole, then further down and further down the valley. And we can trace them along large distances. The BGS have done a similar study, and they have actually connected a number of boreholes around Hertfordshire by just following the traces from the natural gamma. Now, obviously, this requires some interpretation, and there is some expert judgment into this, but largely, we know where these things are, and we know what controls we can use. There are other horizons in the chalk. We talked about the chalk rock earlier. The chalk rock is a horizon that is very important in terms of groundwater flow, because it has high permeability and it acts as a motorway for the groundwater. In a number of occasions where the chalk rock outcrops, there is a spring that forms there, and that is the case in this particular catchment further down. And also the Melbourne rock, again, there are associated springs, although in the Chilterns, the Melbourne rock is found at depth typically. So our boreholes, these particular ones, do intercept the Melbourne rock. So we talked about the marls, we talked about the stratigraphy of the chalk, we talked about possible hindrance in the vertical scale, low permeability layers, and so on. One other thing I try to do is take information from historic borehole logs and try to understand spatially where that phenomenon happens of pressurization in the chalk. So I came across a number of borehole logs that those boreholes no longer exist. They're very old, they're back in 1900s and so on. This particular one is back 1911. You know, things like this statement: boring to supply, blah blah blah, in neighboring houses. Water overflows, but in dry seasons is about 15 foot down. Obviously, in this case, we had a flowing artesian borehole, which typically overflowed. This is next to a place called Chalfont Mill, so obviously there was a mill nearby. The artesian borehole helped turn the mill, but in drought conditions, it dropped below the top of the borehole, so there was no artesian flow anymore. And obviously they had to do something about it, put a pump or do something about it and take the water up. Now, this borehole does not exist anymore. There is a pumping station nearby. But what this tells me is that back in the days, there used to be pressurization in the chalk. Now, whether this pressurization still exists or does not exist, whether the borehole drilling for public water supply or other reasons has connected those layers or not, and whether there's still depressurization or pressurization under pumping or non-pumping conditions is another story. But the thing is that whatever the geology that caused this pressurization is still there, and we need to understand whether that is still the case. Now, here's an example of an artesian borehole, which is still ongoing. There's lots of them actually around dotted around in the Chilterns, and the primary use was feeding watercress beds. The reason for that is that the temperature of the water in the chalk is constant. It's about 10-11 degrees all year round during the summer and winter. So in the winter it doesn't freeze, so it's a good quality, good supply of water. Now, what that means though is that these boreholes, like this one, it's still flowing today, would feed certain ponds, and then they would overflow to the nearby river. So effectively, they would depressurize the chalk aquifer locally, and they would supply the river with effectively extra water, the water that is not meant to be base flow, just naturally bubbling up, but it is a man-made thing whereby we're actively supporting the river. So it is very important to understand where these are, because first of all, they give us an idea of pressurization, and then secondly, they give us an idea of the flow that is added to the river artificially. Now, we did a mapping exercise to understand where these are today, and these are some of them. It's not just these, there's a lot of them actually out there. And we looked at some old maps to understand where these used to be, typically associated, as I say, with watercress production. Now, a number of them appear in this particular arc that we've drawn here, which suggests that there is some spatial distribution potentially linked to certain stratigraphy in the chalk. If you remember, I said earlier that at the top of these chalk streams, we typically have the Holywell and the Newbit, and then the river in the middle bit of the catchments flow through the Lewis chalk. So there is something between the Lewis and the Newbit that causes this pressurization and causes these particular artesian boreholes here to be orientated more or less in these areas. There's further artesian boreholes down catchment, but here we know, based on the depth of those boreholes, that it is impossible for these to penetrate the Newbit chalk as the Newbit dives under London towards here. So here we're definitely in the Lewis. Up here we're definitely in the Newbit. Yet we see artesian conditions up here and artesian conditions down here. Even today, even 500 meters away from a big abstraction. So despite the fact that there are abstractions there and have been developed over time, there is still pressurization in the chalk the moment you go away from the immediate cone of depression. That is quite key and quite important. Now, obviously, if an artesian borehole is within the cone of depression, it may be affected under certain circumstances, especially if they're screened into the same sections of the chalk as the abstraction borehole is. It's like having a bypass flow. So, and we found borehole logs that actually say the same thing, that an artesian borehole was flowing until a public water supply was installed nearby, targeting the same depth. Therefore, the artesian borehole overflow was reduced or stopped in extreme circumstances. But as I say, it is very important to understand this because this additional flow adds to the river base flow, and we now measure it at the bottom of the catchment in a particular gauging station and say there is chalk groundwater. It is chalk groundwater, but it is artificially derived. So in terms of how we now think about the chalk and how we conceptualize the chalk, obviously it's a lot more complex, but what we've seen through a number of observations is that we're typically playing with the Lewis chalk, the Glynde marls, the Newbit chalk, and the Holywell, and a couple of discrete units like the chalk rock at the top over here, and the Melbourne rock down here. The primary groundwater flow in these horizons is well known and has been well documented. What is less known is the interaction in the vertical scale. Where you have these fractures that are vertical or subvertical that do go through the marls, you can have potentially filtering passage through these sections. And we know that there is some connectivity between Newbit and Lewis under abstraction influence. Not full connectivity, but some connectivity. So this acts as a leaky aquifer section. Now, the primary flow direction, though, we think is along the bedding. So when groundwater would move down and meet one of those low permeability materials, we would have enhanced flow along this horizon and enhanced carstification around these horizons. This is what was documented also by BGS, Dr. Adin Farrand, who sent us this photo in northern France, where again we're dealing with marls in the Newbit chalk. What you have here is subvertical fractures stopping at the marl interface, and that's where we have spring flow. So obviously this is an exposure here, but imagine in a borehole, we see very similar things. If I go back, subvertical fractures stopping at the marls and then having preferential flow down and just above the marl interface. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the abstraction reductions and what we have seen from places where we've switched off the abstraction. And this is one of the examples in the middle Ver catchment. With this purple line, you see the deep groundwater level. So under pumping, we're about 69 meters above ordinance datum. The pumping switches off from this section onwards. This is 2016 up to the end of 2019. So there is good recovery in terms of deep groundwater levels from 69 up to 84 meters AOD. So 15 meters or so recovery. Here we have the shallow borehole, the shallow chalk, which is basically the Lewis. Let's call it the Newbit, the deep, the Lewis, the shallow. There is abstraction influence here, and there is a 40 centimeter recovery upon abstraction cessation. It is this recovery that you see here. And then we have river level nearby. This is the river Ver nearby, which does not seem to respond immediately here. But the interesting thing is that once recovery has taken place, the shallow aquifer, the Lewis, meets the river level and has very similar fluctuation with the river level, but then departs during this time and this time. So previously, under abstraction influence, the shallow water level was lower than where it would have been, because we see this 40 centimeters recovery. So it is lower than where it should be by 40 centimeters. So there is some contribution from the shallow aquifer to the deep under abstraction influence. But when it switches off, the groundwater level in the deep aquifer jumps above river level and shallow aquifer and is maintained above all the time. Now, initially, there's a 2-meter differential in the head, which reduces down to about 1 meter or so during the drought of 2017. This is the low water levels of 2017. However, what this suggests is that there is pressurization in the deep chalk, in the Newbit chalk, because this differential in the head is maintained at all times under non-abstraction influence. So from this point onwards. And that is the case during average conditions like 2016, drought conditions 2017, again close to average conditions in 2018, and again leading to the drought conditions of 2019. So we've documented that this pressurization exists in the chalk and it exists at all times. The interesting thing here is that following the full recovery here in the shallow chalk, where the shallow chalk and the river are having similar fluctuations, we reach a period where there are losses between the river and the aquifer, the shallow aquifer. In this case, river level is higher, shallow aquifer is lower. So during this time, you have water leaving the river to recharge the aquifer through the riverbed. So instead of a continuously gaining chalk stream during this time and during this time, it is losing. When the reverse happens, the shallow groundwater level is above river level, the aquifer feeds the river. Now, how can this happen? How can these losses happen whilst you have a pressurized system sitting at the bottom, sitting at depth? This suggests that if this water level is not able to push this shallow water level up to at least river level, it means that this connectivity in the vertical scale is there, but it's not as significant to push this water level up. And definitely the two systems do not talk to each other freely as we thought they would do. Now, the other thing is that I've put this dashed line here to show that during average conditions with pumping on, we reach a certain baseline groundwater level, which is then again reached during droughts. So although there is no abstraction anymore here from this point onward, the river reaches, the shallow aquifer reaches a similar baseline level, and the river is constantly losing throughout this time. Now here, we would just have a cone of depression formed under abstraction influence. Here, there's no cone of depression anymore because there's no pumping. However, the drought has masked the abstraction impact and has caused a widespread reduction in the groundwater level. So moving on to another interesting thing that we found, again from a different scenario here, again abstraction cessation. What we have is a long section down catchment, so that's distance in meters in this axis, and groundwater level on this left axis. Shallow borehole here, shallow borehole there on the two ends, representing this water level and this water level. This is the Lewis chalk here and here, relatively shallow boreholes. And then we have the two production boreholes in the middle, here and here, which are screened into the Newbit chalk. So under non-pumping conditions and after equilibrium has been reached after a couple of months following the cessation of abstraction, we see this paradox whereby you connect the two water levels in meters AOD from here to here in the shallow, and you have this particular gradient of the groundwater. And you connect again the two water levels under non-pumping conditions in the two deep production boreholes that are not pumping anymore, and you have this gradient. So obviously, these are two very different gradients, and thus suggests for the first time that it is possible to have very different gradients at a localized scale, which, although up to now it was thought to be based on the abstraction influence, now we can see that it can also happen during non-pumping conditions. So no abstraction influence here. Yet, just because these two boreholes are screened into the Newbit section, they behave different hydraulically, and during this particular snapshot in time, they had very different gradients. So to put it all together then, what we've seen is a number of things, such as marl bands within the chalk. Down here at the bottom left, we discussed about the marl bands, we discussed about the Artesian conditions they can cause, how these boreholes can feed the river, what happens if you have an abstraction nearby, whether this water would be at the expense of the flow of these Artesian boreholes or the river itself flowing down here or not. But we can also have paleochannels and glacial infilling, like this particular case. This is from the Mimram catchment. This is the A1M here. There's approximately 30-40 meter deep buried channel filled with material like sands and clays and gravels of different permeability, with low permeability layers within them. And we know that these can confine the chalk locally and cause the chalk boreholes to be Artesian. And that is the case even today, with or without abstraction influence. Another thing that we have also seen is what we call the putty chalk, that can also act like a sponge, if you like, and inhibit flow in the vertical scale. So where you have a river sitting on top of the putty chalk, you can have some buffering effect between the two. So although the water that you may no longer abstract stays there, it is not freely available to enter the river at all conditions. And then combinations of them. So all three scenarios in one go, where you have Artesian flows, you can have buried channels or multiple buried channels, marl bands within the chalk, abstraction or no abstraction, and so on. So you appreciate that this whole thing gets very complicated very quickly when you have combination of scenarios. One other thing I would like to touch on today is the added systems. So a number of our boreholes have what we call addits. These are horizontal tunnels that deviate away from the vertical, from the borehole or the well. And the primary reason of this was to enhance the permeability of the boreholes. So I have a video to show you where people actually were lowered down the well. We're talking about 2-meter diameter wells here or so. We would have pumping nearby to lower the groundwater table artificially and allow them to go in here and start digging horizontally those tunnels. Now, obviously, the pumping need to happen nearby to lower the water level, because if the pumps would go off, then these people would need to run for their lives. So I have a video that I think is from the 1950s, but we're not sure exactly where it has been shot. But it is very interesting just to give you an understanding of what they did back then. You see water flowing into the borehole. This is under abstraction influence, but there's still water pouring from the top. This looks like rail tracks here. You can see these people here digging the chalk, filling up the buckets, extending those tunnels, those added systems in various directions. We don't know exactly why they chose the direction to dig their way through, but it is possible that they were following a hypermeability horizon or a particular marl band, or above a certain marl band or a flint band. But it is interesting to see. Yeah, for example, here you can see this black feature is almost definitely, and again here, a flint band. So here they just hit a fissure which is under pressure. It brought water in the borehole, and they're getting away, waiting for this to clear up, and hopefully to stop flowing, or at least the pumping influence would lower the water table. Otherwise, if it would flood the tunnel, they would need to run for their lives. And again, here you see another flint band, which is nicely depicted. Yeah, so health and safety was not so much of an issue at the time, but obviously we do not do these things these days. We do send the camera there to inspect the adits and understand what condition they're in, but this is a legacy of the past. And again, you can see nice flint pads here and here. Very quickly, just wary of time, to touch about carstification in the chalk. At the edge of the Paleogene, where we have runoff, acidic runoff from the London clay, we can have swallow holes being formed. So things like this and this. This is in the Mimsel Brook catchment. We have a main swallow hole complex around here, and this whole area drains down the Mimsel Brook and enters into this series of swallow holes, which look like this. This is under low flow conditions. I was able to go down there and take photos, but basically you have approximately 15 meters or so of material sitting above the chalk, and then a drain down into the chalk, causing a permanent recharge mound, a groundwater high just below this area. So this is preferential recharge, obviously bypass recharge. There's no infiltration here. We're talking about karstic pipes, dissolution pipes, bringing water down, and water from here is found in springs towards the Lee Valley with velocities up to 3, 4, or 5 kilometers a day. So very fast moving groundwater through tunnel-like systems, dissolution pipes, and so on. On the flip side, you can have contamination, because any surface water can enter these systems and recharge the aquifer very quickly, but whatever contaminants it may carry, they are carried into the chalk aquifer with minimal filtration. So it is important from a water resources perspective, but from a water quality perspective, there can be issues associated with this. Another thing I would like to touch quickly is the role of superficial deposits in the base flow, in the river base flow, in the chalk stream base flow. And this started from an observation back in 2018, the summer of 2018, which was very dry. The month of June and July of 2018 were very dry months, with almost zero rainfall recorded in a number of drain gauges. So these are some graphs taken from the EA's water situation report that show the gauged flow at the bottom of the catchment, or the Ver catchment, the Gade, the Colne, and the Mimram. And you see that very quickly the banding changed from being normal to below normal, or even going to notably low within 2 months. Now, the interesting thing here is that the chalk groundwater levels had just reached their seasonal peak at the end of May, beginning of June. So the chalk aquifer was relatively healthy at the time, still below average, but relatively healthy. Yet 2 months of no rainfall during the summer caused this dramatic drop. Not everywhere, but in some of the cases, it's more pronounced than others. So like in this case and in this case, we went from one banding to another banding, not so much here, not so much here. So we started thinking about what other base flow is coming into the system that we do not take into account, or it is thought to be a chalk base flow, but it's actually a different base flow. Because normally we would not expect to see this being depleted during this time, yet it shows that it was depleted. So we started thinking about the role of superficial deposits, the alluvium, the sands and gravels, the other material other than the chalk, sitting above the chalk and potentially acting as a buffer, storing water during rainfall, even summer rainfall, and releasing the water and adding to the base flow. Other issues I'm not going to talk about today, but just wanted to briefly go over climate change. Everybody talks about climate change, the where, the when, the how much water, what's the intensity, and so on. And also the land use change over time. We think this is really important because it can affect recharge, how recharge gets into the system. This is a longer term hydrograph. It's 1979 to date. You can see the 80s, the water levels jumped around quite a bit, but not as much. And we mainly stayed above the long-term average, which is the first wiggly line. And then from the 90s onwards, we started seeing the lows and the highs very quickly, from drought to flood within a year or two in some cases. And then very recently, 2017, 2019 droughts. And then within 2 years, we had flood conditions earlier this year. So we think climate change is here and it is affecting the water resources. Last slide before we go to conclusions. We didn't talk about water quality much, but actually when we look at chalk groundwater quality and we look at specific tracers, things like nitrates, for instance, we can see that it is possible to have two boreholes right next to one another, two production boreholes being pumped as duty standby at the same rate, having different open hole. This is a deeper one into the Newbit. This is higher up into the Lewis. So from 20 to 30 meters, it gets its water from this one from 20 to 80 meters. You can see differences in nitrate concentrations. This one being around about 30 to 35. This is being in the 40 to 45. So 10 milligrams per liter difference in nitrate concentrations is quite a lot. And we think this is potential evidence of stratification in here from a quality perspective, where the nitrate has entered the shallow aquifer, but not the deep to the same extent. And here we have dilution. So to conclude, we have improved our understanding, but we need to understand the geology even better, the chalk geology better, and to understand the influence on the horizontal and the vertical flow. We used geological mapping and geophysics. The role of the superficial deposit is still largely unknown. We are looking into investigate this more and drill more boreholes and understand and do pumping tests to understand the storage of those deposits. Very, very critical is to understand the monitor the water level fluctuation and also the water quality, so that we put everything down and try to understand the system as a whole. Talked about water quality, climate change, land use changes, and recharge variations. Obviously, they need to continue to be evaluated. And collaboration is key in order to share knowledge and develop robust conceptual models so that we can inform decision making and policy. Now, before I end the presentation, very quickly, Save Our Streams campaign. You may have seen it, you may have been part of it. If you haven't, I would urge you to go to the website, find out more about our campaign. This is a campaign to help people understand about the water use and reduce our demand for water, so that we save more water, leave it in the environment, and help the chalk streams flow more, have more base flow in them. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ilias. Could you stop sharing your screen? It's lovely. Then we can see everybody. That was really fascinating. I hadn't realised just how complicated the water in the chalk was. You tend to think of it, as you said at the beginning, one big bucket, but it's obviously not. Are there any questions? Can you use your raise hand function? That's it. Joan, you've got a question.
Yes, it's not particularly about well, it may be about the chalk. In various places where I've worked, BP at Sunbury, EMI at Hayes, they have had boreholes which they've used the water from, and certainly at Sunbury the water was pretty ropey. Would this have been into the chalk, or would this have been into a different layer?
I don't know if anybody else can jump in there and help me with the stratigraphy elsewhere. Possibly, but I can't say for sure.
I would say at Sunbury, Joan, that it's Hayden here. It was almost certainly going to be probably drawn out of the Thames gravels, so it's not likely to have gone as deep as the chalk.
Right, that's quite logical, because it certainly had a sort of iron tinge to it.
Yeah,
it was used for cooling water and things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
You can put your videos back on again now, then we can see your faces.
the other borehole that I was aware of was that Whitbreads had a borehole, which when they were producing beer in the city, but I presume that one did go down to the chalk because they did need a reasonable quality of water.
Yeah, it is possible.
I think
breweries.
it's likely, Joan. Yeah.
Hayden, you've got a question.
I've probably got several, but we can talk about it at length. I'm just curious about the fact that you recognize that you could separate out the way that the unstructured putty chalk behaves. And I just wondered if you could give us any more details. Does it hold on to the water? Does it act like a clay and block the water? How does it impact on flow?
What we know is that from, again, doing pumping tests or signal tests, whereby we're varying the abstraction, there is a buffering effect.
Yeah.
So the water level above the putty chalk does respond to a degree. For example, down in the Mid-Colne Valley, we know it does respond. However, it's like a sponge. So it is not a direct connectivity. It partly acts as a leaky aquifer, not quite the same way as the marls do, because effectively it allows an equilibrium to be reached, so the two water levels under pumping influence to separate and then to meet again. Whereas with the marls, as we saw earlier, you can have pressurization that is constant all the time, so there's a fixed leakage, whereas with the putty chalk, we do not normally see that. Now, how putty is putty, and where do you go from location to location? You can have slightly different characteristics. Because it depends on the weathering of the chalk and how broken the chalk is, and how this layer would behave hydraulically may change from place to place. But yeah, typically where we've done pumping tests, we haven't seen this same separation that you see with the marls, but it does cause a buffering effect.
Okay.
Nick, you've got a question.
Yeah, I have. Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you very much, Ilias. That was a really good, fascinating presentation, as always. A couple of questions, or a couple of points really related. You talked about collaboration and the importance of data. Where do you see the next steps coming from? And do you think there'll be some minimum data requirements stipulated that is mandatory from a borehole, such that we can maximize our information that we gather and retrieve?
Following these data and these kind of presentations that I've delivered to a number of groups, including the Environment Agency, there has been a lot of work going on in the background, including the British Geological Survey, who have been doing mapping. There's a specific focus as we speak at the superficial deposits, in order to understand the role of the superficial deposits, because really what we're talking about here is reducing abstraction in the Newbit chalk, hoping that will enter the Lewis chalk, hoping that will go into the superficial deposits, that then in turn feed the river. So we need to understand this whole sequence very, very well, and we need to throw everything we can at it. Because the reason we're doing this is to allow more river flow. If we do not get that, we're spending millions of pounds to bring the water from elsewhere, and there's more and more and more of that will be needed in the future. So more and more of those big schemes, whether it's a reservoir, a transfer, whatever it is, will be triggered going forward. So we need to have certainty that this benefit will be realized. But as I say, I see geology as the #1 factor here, and knowing the chalk stratigraphy very, very well to begin with, and then start building up superficial deposits, river, groundwater interactions. With time, what I would see personally as the longer term aspiration is to be able to have to allow the chalk to be split into different blocks and be licensed differently, rather than a borehole in the chalk licensed for so many megaliters. I would like to see some layering in there. Now, we're not there yet. There are steps toward this. The Environment Agency have revised their groundwater model. They have included more than one layer. We're throwing data at it. We're trying this conceptual understanding. We're doing further work. The BGS is involved, others are involved, and so on, just to understand how the system works.
And it seems to be a real appreciation that it's a good deal more complex than a simple tank that might have been the geological model of a couple of decades ago.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've gradually moved away from that. Now, we always knew geologically, any geologist would know that these things already, that they exist in the chalk. What we didn't know is the hydrostratigraphy. When you put water into that stratigraphy, what does that mean?
Sure.
Because what we now know, and the way this is regulated is from the Environment Agency, is that the chalk is over licensed and over abstracted. Well, which chalk? Which river are we trying to save? Under what conditions? The other thing that we found out is that you can get a different benefit of switching abstraction off during drought conditions and different benefit when you switch it off under flood conditions. So the whole system acts in a dynamic way. It's not uniform. It acts in a dynamic way. So previously, what we would do is a pumping test, quantifying the benefit as, let's say, 50% of the abstraction you take will end up in the river flow. And we would carry that benefit through the whole flow spectrum and say, you have a fixed amount of water that you will get at all times in the river. Well, that is no longer the case. But with these things, if you don't do certain changes, you can't monitor. That's why I'm saying always monitoring is key, throwing data at it is key, testing those conceptual ideas through a groundwater model is key to understand whether they would work or not. And then going back, having a loop system whereby you're collecting data, making decisions, running them past the groundwater model and coming back to it and creating a full circle.
That's right. I mean, it's a value of information really exercise, a value of information exercise that people have got to go through, understand what questions have got to be answered and what data is required to answer those questions. That's
Absolutely.
very interesting. Thank you very much.
Sandy. You're muted.
Yes, I've thank you very much for this. Have you noticed you've got records go back quite a long way? Have you noticed any effects of this sort of increased urbanization? I mean, it's quite a long time since I lived in the area, and I remember the River Pin flooding quite dramatically, quite close to my house. But buildings going on everywhere. And here, where I live now near Bristol, we get more and more localized flooding because everything's covered in concrete.
That's right. Yes, I touched a little bit on that, but we haven't got data to show as such. Now, a colleague of mine tried to do an assessment of the land use change over time. So the urbanization of catchment, the more hard-standing areas and so on. And what she did is she looked at times when the soil moisture deficit would be at or close to zero, so where we would expect recharge, and looking at the runoff at the bottom gauging station of the catchment, and you would see over time that the runoff spikes would increase at a time where you would expect to have recharge. So that is an indirect way of saying over time, obviously this happens over decades, the increased urbanization will create more runoff and less infiltration. So this is going to be another effect on groundwater levels. So it's not necessarily just less rainfall, but with the same rainfall, you're having a difference between runoff and infiltration. So yes, we don't have data exactly to say that what is the exact cause and effect, but we know it's there and we know it is significant. So absolutely.
Nikki Edwards.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the lecture, Ilias. Brilliant. I live in Welling Garden City, which is between the Mimram and the Lee. And our area is under huge pressure to do a lot more building. Now, you're already working our damnedest to give us our water. At what point in the planning exercise do they consult you?
So we liaise with local councils, and we have an idea as to what's coming up, and we use that to inform our water resources management plan, which is put every 5 years, to basically say how we're going to meet the demand now, i.e. in the next 5 years, and long term up to 2080 or 2100. When we do our supply demand balance, we need to know what to expect, both globally within the whole company and also locally, because that makes a difference as to what booster station we need to put in, what additional pipes we need to put in to bring water in, and so on. So we do get involved. Now, whether that is always at an early stage, that depends on the relationship between us and the respective council. Yeah. So we think we got the ballpark right, and with more and more communication between us and the local council, we'll be able to get better at it. But the reality is that there is more population in this area. There will be more population in this area in the years to come, and the supply will decrease from now on due to these various pressures. So we will need to pump water from greater and greater distances to be used locally and then discharged locally via the sewage works. I didn't talk a lot about the sewage works because we are a water-only company, but if you're looking at the whole water cycle, where the water is actually abstracted, where it's treated, where it is transferred, where it is used up, and where it returns to the system as treated effluent, it can be a very different story.
Have you ever been in a position where you've said, no, you can't develop, we can't supply, or must you supply?
So we have to supply, but obviously we have a say as to, If we're consulted in this, we have a say as to where there is water or there is no water available. But overall, we have to supply, we have some zones, for instance, that the available supply within those zones is less than the demand in those zones, even now. And what we have to do is transfer internally water from A to B to C to where it's needed. But the way, the direction of travel is that more and more we're pushing water further and further and further afield. And increasingly, understanding the carbon footprint is also quite key, because the water is heavy, pumping it a number of times, electricity, carbon footprint, and everything has to be taken into account. So when we're looking at the environment holistically, we have to take all these different pieces of the jigsaw and make an informed decision. But at the end of the day, if a development is going to go in a particular area, then we have to supply that particular development. We cannot do otherwise.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
Going round again. Hayden, have you got another question?
I do, and Ilias, I have to say, it's lovely to see you again. We haven't had contact all the way through the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, so it's great to re-establish contact. You mentioned several times about the additional or the new survey work that the BGS has been doing in the region, particularly throughout the Chilterns. I just wonder, given we've been talking so much about recognizing the vertical variations within the chalk, and we in the past, or in fact we still talk about river catchment areas, but we now recognize that there's going to be lateral movement, lateral subsurface movement. And I just wondered whether, you have methodologies of being able to monitor whether you're seeing water movement subsurface from, say, the Misbourne across into the Colne, which I believe, this is one of the things that Andy Farrant flagged up with me at one stage. So there does seem to be evidence for it, but I just wondered if you are able to monitor that.
So the monitoring that we have already put in consists of a number of boreholes at different sections of the chalk, and we try to compare like for like now, Newbit with Newbit, Lewis with Lewis, and so on. So we know exactly what happens where we are, and monitor the impact of the sustainability reductions. In a number of cases, we have seen groundwater level rebound at a downstream borehole without necessarily seeing a river flow increase or as much of a river flow increase as we would like to. This suggests that the majority of the water that we no longer abstract stays in the aquifer and moves laterally. Now, understanding the chalk piezometry in detail, so if we're talking about Newbit piezometry versus Lewis piezometry, is also important, although in the global scale, you don't see big differences. If you don't have the you can have different gradients, but you don't have different flow directions as such. So if the Lewis piezometry shows that the water is going from A to B, then the Newbit is very likely to do the same, maybe different gradient, but it will be the similar direction. And the groundwater flow in the Chilterns is, as you know, northwest to southeast, mainly following the course of the rivers. Now, in some cases, like the Misbourne, the rivers turn to a different direction, or like the Chess, it turns from a west-east or northwest-southeast to a southerly direction. The groundwater contours do not always follow that route. Like the Misbourne, for example, we know it's losing downstream of Chalfont St Giles because the chalk groundwater contours export water from the Misbourne to the Colne. So the water goes under the M25 and into the Colne catchment, whereas the River Misbourne turns south towards Chalfont St Peter. So between the two Chalfonts, the river is losing dramatically, like 80% of the water that's in the river is lost to ground because the contours just take it away. But the exact mechanism, there's no exact mechanism of measuring that groundwater outflow. We have to use Darcy's law, we have to use contours, we have to use some assumptions basically to calculate the groundwater outflow from a certain catchment. So that is one of the uncertainties there. However, we can test whether our conceptual understanding is correct, because if you allow too much export, too much groundwater outflow, then the water balance will not work. you will create a deficit in somewhere else in the water balance. That's where the groundwater models come in that help us test those conceptual understandings. And if you allow too much water outflow by increasing the permeability of a certain layer, then you will mess up the whole thing. And the groundwater levels, you will not be able to calibrate on groundwater levels or river flows.
Sure.
It's just that up to now, there's a lot of focus on river flows, and you can get the groundwater model very well calibrated on river flows for the wrong reasons. So, and we had instances in the past where, you know, there was a lot of talk about the perfect groundwater model and how we can use it for all sorts of decisions. Every tool has pros and cons. And in this particular case, it was doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. And when we said, look, the geological representation there is wrong, it's obviously wrong. So obviously the good calibration that you achieved doesn't mean that you have a good model. It just means that you managed to somehow fix it and have very good calibration on one parameter only. But typically groundwater levels are very difficult to calibrate in any groundwater model. So yeah, so there are tools around, but the tools are as good as the data that go into them.
Okay, we need it. I appreciate that. So, you know, as I say, great to hear you again. So thanks very much for that and for the explanation.
Thank you, Hayden. I think we need to repeat that Kensworth Quarry field trip. That was very
I
eye-opening
would
for
love
me.
to do that. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I think they're becoming more friendly again. So let's think about it.
Brilliant.
Right, Joan, you've got another question.
Well, yes, it's a sort of the elephant in the room. How much cooperation are you getting from HS2?
I was waiting for that to come up.
With the geologist hat on, I have pushed HS2 to put out the information they get, because obviously they've drilled a number of boreholes, and the Misbourne is one of the catchments where they have drilled lots of GI boreholes. And you know, as I say, as a geologist, I would like to see this information being out there, and have one catchment where the geology is very well documented. I think that is an opportunity from that perspective. So obviously there is data sharing between us and HS2. We need to understand any potential impacts on our sources, and we do risk assessments and so on constantly. So we talk to them as the Environment Agency do, as other organizations do as well. Yeah, I don't know what else I'm allowed to say really, but all I can say is that we talk to them on a frequent basis on a number of things, obviously with the ultimate goal to safeguard our abstractions while HS2 is being built.
Yeah.
Yes, I seem to remember when I was at BP that there was a sort of, when they did boreholes, they had to provide the information to Natural England and so, but I suppose they could say that they wouldn't want you to share it necessarily.
So they have to share certain information with us because we have agreements with them. And also I understand the geological information has been passed to the BGS. So that should help them build a nice conceptual model of the Misbourne, the Colne Valley, and the whole HS2 route effectively. So yes, that kind of information will be there. Obviously, as a hydrogeologist, I'm interested in the water level information, you know, things that I showed earlier, Lewis versus Newbit, whether we see pressurization, where we don't see pressurization, where there are Artesian conditions, where there are not Artesian conditions, and so on. So, and that is information they also need to know as the tunnel goes in the Chilterns. So they have a good monitoring network, which they generate data from, and we also review the data along with the Environment Agency who are overlooking this.
Oh, that's something. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Anybody else got any questions for Ilias? Ilias, I think you've done a magnificent job. It's been a really interesting talk. and you've certainly answered all the questions very, very well. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you very much.
In the good old days, we would have taken you out to dinner, but we can't do that. So there will be an Amazon voucher coming your way as a thank you for giving up your time this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Right.
everyone.
Now, hang on.